Ahoy, you salty sailors. Time to raise anchor and set sail for your best scrawny life. Arr.
We'll start with a bit of kayak talk here. The manufacturer of the Oru kayak does not recommend the lake model being used to run rapids, but I did do it, and in this case there was a large rock I tried to steer around. The kayak with its flat bottom just slid, and I did take a direct hit on that rock, and aside from a bit of scratching, the Oru kayak did survive the encounter. So although that is not what the manufacturer recommends doing with it, it's a little stronger than it appears apparently. Here an island divides the river into two rocky chutes, and I haven't been on this section of the river in several years, but the last time I was here, a tree had fallen over one of the chutes that branched out in such a way as to have two sweepers extending completely over this particular chute. And such was the danger that it presented that I actually wrote a poem about this sweeper, and it went a little something like this. So it's just a scrap of doggerel, but being a rather dull-witted man, that's about as close to poetic as I ever get. So I was quite proud of it, and it remains so even after a couple of years. But in the meantime, it did present enough danger that someone actually went to the trouble of bringing a chainsaw down here and cutting the sweeper. I mean, we're several miles from the nearest access point, so it did earn its reputation apparently. Thankfully, I have been strong enough in the last month to be able to car top my hard shell kayak. It's about the limit of what I can do, but I have been able to do it. I have a little roller that helps in some cases, but I have actually been able to just lift and car top it like I used to. Doing that twice in one day is about the limit of what I can do, but I have done it and without any lingering back pain. Unfortunately, the river fishing has been a bit spotty. We've had some scattered showers here and there that muddied up a couple of the rivers, and those that were at a decent level had an algae bloom going due to some past runoff, and the lake as well had a bit of an algae bloom and had some issues going on with a stretch of hot weather that kept the fish further offshore than they had been in the last couple of years, or at least that's how it seemed. There were still plenty of gizzard shad running the shoreline, and a lot of the small white bass chasing them. Now, because it didn't have favorable wind conditions, I expected slow fishing on the white bass, so I had brought a bait rod, which I used some cut gizzard shad and set that out at, just cast it from shore. So it did seem like the larger white bass and wipers were further offshore until something pulled down my bait rod, pulled it completely out of the rocks where I had propped it up. A decent sized fish, a nice large fish here. And I was expecting a catfish, but sure enough, there was a wiper. So they were coming within casting range. That bait rod was not beyond my fly casting range. So they were coming within range, and apparently depth was the factor rather than distance. So I tried slowing down the retrieve, but never really did make contact with the bigger white bass. Still, I put on a smaller fly to trail the main fly and still was catching the small ones. But just couldn't get deep enough, apparently. even though I am using a Type 3 full sinking line here, but that's mainly to prevent the line getting tangled up and wrapped up with itself in the waves, especially if the wind picks up. You know, in this particular moment there, that wasn't a great concern, but if the wind picks up a bit, it can wrap up a floating line in the waves pretty bad. Elsewhere, the smallmouth bass have been biting. I got a decent one here on the Wapsipinicon River. I'm standing behind this log, and I'm still having some trouble, some pain, and some difficulty bending over. And I had quite a time trying to land this fish. But eventually I did just hand over hand it. It got her landed. Nice looking smallmouth. This is the dam in Anamosa, right by the entrance to Wapsipinicon State Park. And there were several more smallmouth that won't be shown here, but and another one about this size that I missed. I struck a fly and I missed it. So that's a pretty decent place to fish right there. As I mentioned, we'd had some scattered rainfall. The water in the Wapsipinicon was actually muddier than the Cedar River, which, I mean, you wouldn't expect that at all, but thus it was. Now, this is a plant that I have not even seen during all the years of the drought, like the last 4 years. Haven't even seen it. This is the ghost plant, Monotropa uniflora. Now, you'll remember we've talked about wood betony, which is a hemiparasite. This plant produces no chlorophyll at all. It's a holoparasite. It gets all of its nutrition by tapping into the underground mycelial network, the fungal network in the soil. Of course, fungi also do not photosynthesize or produce their own food. They get it from trees and plants, so this plant indirectly parasitizes trees. Now here's a mushroom I have not seen in years, Lacaria ocropurpurea. There it is with its distinctive purple gills. It generally has that bulbous and curved type of stem. And of course, this is another mycorrhizal species, so it emerges from the ground or through the ground in oak and hickory type woodlands. It is said to be edible. Personally, I have never tried it. After those long years of the drought, I'm just glad to see it again. Here's a similar looking mushroom, but one that is quite different. You'll notice along the top of the stem there are some fibers, some brown colored fibers, and along the margin of the cap there are also some fibers. This is the remnants of a cortina, because this is, of course, a cortinarius mushroom. The cortina is a webby veil that once stretched between the upper part of the stem and the margin of the cap before the cap had fully unrolled. Later, when the spore dust began to fall, the typical rusty brown spore color of the cortinarius species accumulated on the remnants of the cortina, giving it that brown color. Time for a geology minute. Here we have some marl. It can be this gray clay stone, but it can also be this dense clay that forms the basic structure of the riverbed. Although there's gravel and sand on top of it, the marl is basically what composes the riverbed. It has some calcium carbonate, of course, and is part of the general sedimentary landscape that we find here. But spread over top of this is the glacial till, including some large igneous erratics like this basalt boulder. And there are many similar basalt boulders in the river here. These, of course, are glacial erratics, which would have been encased in ice, although there may have been a significant amount of liquid water involved in their transportation here, and why there are so many of them in this one particular area, because it's not until a little ways further north, on the north branch of the Raccoon River, that we start to see the glacial topography, moraines and so forth, associated with the boundaries of the Des Moines lobe, and then the glacial topography that extends into northern Iowa. The original source of the basalt would likely be somewhere even further north, perhaps associated with the North American mid-continent rift itself, which is the bedrock of this entire area, and we are just at the northern extremity of what is called the Southern Iowa Drift Plain, where we might well try to imagine what sort of fluid process began the initial cutting of Hanging Rock Bluff here, and further downstream where the middle and south branches join, some interestingly cut sandstone. Dabbling for a few carp here, I did eventually get a take out of about 4 or 5 carp that were feeding in this particular little cove.
I was on the lake earlier, the main part of the lake, going for white bass, so I only have 8-pound tippet on. I don't have a clear visual yet how big this carp actually is, but I don't want to push it. Broke that 8-pound tippet right at the grab.
So you can see the mud line in the water here, and a lot of gizzard shad jumping just inside that mud line. So I interpreted that to mean a school of white bass was patrolling the outside of the mud line, but I never did get a bite out of them, if indeed that's what it was. Now you can see here the water is warmer than the air, and it's not a cold day. I'm dressed in a t-shirt and shorts, but the water is just so hot from that stretch of hot weather we had that quite a bit of steam is rising. Here's the fly we're looking at, a jig hook clouser. The bend in the jig hook is where the eye is tied in, and that prevents the head from spinning around the shank of the hook. So there's a decent one, but yeah, I whatever was chasing those shad in the mud line, maybe perhaps it was not white bass. Anyway, we can't see the bait rod anymore. Bait rod down. We've got to run. We've got to hurry. Bait rod down. Could be a large fish. Could be a tasty drumski. There it is. Yes, indeed, we have dinner. That's the second best fish in the lake for eating. There's the rod's going off again. Do we have another one? Yes, indeed, dinner is served. Anyway, that wraps it up for this episode. See you next time.